So, just for an intro for anyone that doesn't have context, this is actually going to be the final round of the mock debate tournament. For this round, Teddy is going to be defending the proposition that non-violent offenders should not be locked up, and Discordius is going to be taking the opposition. So the winner will be based upon who concedes. If nobody concedes, we'll just put it to a voting poll for the audience to decide who they think won. If it does come to a voting poll, please base your vote on who you think had the better argumentation, who performed better in the debate, and who opposed the opposition better. For this debate, you guys have 1 hour, so you can get right into it.
Awesome. I'll start off if you're okay with that.
Yep.
Awesome. So my proposition, or my point, so my point is that I believe that non-violent offenders should be locked up because the capacity to incarcerate non-violent criminals is an essential part of the global legal system, and that some people who may not have committed violent crimes are essential to the committing of other violent crimes. And there are some non-violent crimes that are just as bad, if not worse, than many violent crimes. And I would define a non-violent crime as those crimes that do not involve the use of any force or injury to another person. This includes a whole range of crimes, citations and legal violations, and includes things such as property crime, tax evasion, and fraud. And that's mine.
Okay. Imprisoning someone has serious impacts on the individual, their family, and society at large, and shouldn't be an option unless the offender is a physical danger to others. There is simply no good reason to do so. It is well known and proven through various studies that prisoners suffer trauma from their time in prison, and that recidivism rates are higher the longer someone is in prison. Prisoners often experience violence while in prison and are more likely to have to participate in criminal activities they did not participate in for. Some studies show that once prisoners leave prison, they are more violent than when they entered, which also increases recidivism rates. I think due to overcrowding, PTSD, increase of drug and alcohol abuse, and recidivism, and on the principle of doing harm to others, we should not be imprisoning nonviolent offenders. Discordius, you can go ahead.
Sure. So your proposition or your statement that there's no good reason to incarcerate a person who has not who is not like pose a danger to others. Like there are some people who can't be tried for violent crimes but are still a danger to other people. For instance, Al Capone was technically a non-violent offender because he couldn't be charged for any violent crime. He was indicted for tax evasion. And so technically, Al Capone, an extremely dangerous individual who was a gang boss, was a non-violent offender. And he absolutely posited harm to the people around him. And that's not just Al Capone. He's like one of the more famous cases. But the FBI and the IRS regularly use non-violent crimes to help incarcerate highly dangerous criminals.
Was it actually the case that Al Capone was a nonviolent offender, or is that just because they couldn't prove it in the court?
I would say that like the point is moot here. Like Al Capone was a nonviolent offender by the definition of violent or nonviolent.
How so?
Because he couldn't be indicted for any violent crimes.
Yeah, I just think that if somebody is a crime boss of a violent mob, then you could definitely make a strong case that they are at least the cause indirectly of violence. And I'm not sure if a violent offender has to be legally speaking, like, or if there could be a case made for just having been involved in a violent crime. I kind of want to look that up now.
Oh, I can give you sources for Al Capone and my organized crime plus thing.
Okay, that would be good. Debate chat.
So my problem with like your is that it seems like you're determining that a person is like a violent offender based off of crimes that they technically haven't or can't be proven to commit. Like what level of evidence would you require to incarcerate a non-violent offender as a violent offender for crimes that they technically haven't?
Because I think that if you cause bodily harm, because for example, if you drug somebody's drink, right, then like you haven't necessarily beaten them, but you've caused them violent harm. And I think that the same thing could be said of a mob boss, just because they weren't the one that pulled the trigger. If it can be proven, or like even just reasonably assumed that they ordered people to pull the trigger, because they're a mafia boss, then
wait, so
probably
just by your proximity to a crime, you can be incarcerated as a violent criminal?
No, I don't think by proximity. I think if you can make a case that they caused violent crime, like by a certain degree, by a certain reasonable degree, then.
So would
like
you,
if they were the one that ordered it and you could prove it?
Well, that's technically murder. Like that is a violent crime. If you order the death of a person, you are incarcerated as as part of like the murder investigation. So what I'm talking about here is like crimes such as tax evasion, which we use regularly to help attack and deconstruct criminal networks. And again, Al Capone, most notorious case, like it's very much assumed that he was responsible for violent crimes, but due to like the structure of the criminal network, it was impossible to prove it. However, we could pursue through the white collar crimes that they committed. We could incarcerate these people and greatly benefit society from removing them.
Wait, but if they're bringing him in on tax evasion, but basically sentencing him for being a mafia boss.
No, they're not sentencing him for being a mafia boss.
What was the sentence?
The sentence was multiple life sentences for tax. One second, I'll double check that.
Wait, you can get a life sentence for tax evasion?
I don't know if it's capped. Just give me a sec. I'll double check what his sentence was. But like I know 1939. Oh, okay. So no, he absolutely wasn't given multiple life sentences. So in 1931. So he only went to prison for about like 5 years. But by the time I think it was like 7 to 8 years, which is 6-month court sentence.
Service
11 years in federal prison.
Days.
But he ended up leaving after 7. But yeah, no, like this is part of how like we deconstruct gang networks. And then there's a source, which was the FBI talking about how in the modern day, the same time.
I'm sorry, you were breaking up. What did you say?
And my other source was about how in the modern day, we still use these types of methods to help deconstruct mafia. Help deconstruct mafia and like organized crime groups. And in both cases, these are situations in which it's extremely difficult to try highly dangerous individuals for violent crimes. But because the white collar non-violent crimes can sometimes be easier to determine, we are able to like incarcerate. And so like it's an essential system to almost all legal systems, and the incarcerate otherwise highly dangerous criminals.
Yeah, but I mean, it seems silly to me that we're getting somebody on tax evasion and putting them in prison, because it's kind of setting a precedent that we take somebody else who's not Al Capone, who's not a violent criminal, and then putting them in a violent place where they could potentially become violent or have lasting damage, like to their brain, that would lead them to use drug and alcohol. That would also increase their likelihood of becoming violent.
I'm curious. Sorry, you please finish. Sorry.
I think that it's good that we can use other laws to imprison violent offenders, but I don't think that's an argument against imprisoning non-violent offenders. In fact, like, we could be further endangering non-violent offenders by setting legal precedents that ultimately hurt the non-violent offenders. By the way, non-violent offenders make up almost half of the prison population in the United States. So it's pretty relevant.
I'm curious. So you're saying that by imprisoning this non-violent offender, a person who has greatly endangered society, that it's not a case that it's not relevant to the case of why it's important to imprison non-violent.
I'm saying that I don't think it's worth like imprisoning all of the non-violent tax evaders just because we want to use the tax evasion laws to occasionally imprison violent offenders.
Okay, but there are other violent. First of all, actually, sorry, I'll just stop charging forwards. Like, do you believe in a person is innocent until proven?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're telling me that in a case where we can prove that a person is guilty of a crime, that we shouldn't incarcerate that person simply because of another systemic problem within our society, and that is like the harm that is caused to some non-violent offenders.
Yeah, because prison is an inherently violent place, and it can make people violent.
So what should we do about like these mafia bosses who, like, these decidedly criminal individuals who are able to prove guilty? Like, what should we let them go because we sometimes imprison the wrong people, or that sometimes people who go into prison for like non-violent crimes come out worse? Like, should we ignore one problem to solve another?
Yeah, I'm not sure, because I think I don't know what the ratio of non-violent offenders is compared to like mafia bosses in prison. But
it's not just mafia bosses. It's all members of like a criminal network that can be charged for non-violent crimes. Like Al Capone is like the most infamous example. But like, you have a source there telling you about how many members of the FBI recognizes this as an essential element of their criminal investigation.
So I suppose I should ask you the same question then. Do you believe somebody is innocent until proven guilty?
I absolutely believe that we should treat people as innocent until we can prove them guilty. And like, it's also important to recognize that I fully understand that like recidivism is a problem in certain nonviolent offenders. But I think the problem with recidivism isn't necessarily in the fact that we imprison some nonviolent people, some of whom are decidedly dangerous individuals who've caused monumental amounts of harm. But the problem is in like the wider societal element. We can look at other countries with extremely low recidivism rates, like Norway, and then compare them to America. And the problem, Norway certainly imprisons non-violent people, but they treat their prisoners as human beings, and they have prisons set up to help those non-violent, all prisoners, violent or non-violent. Whereas in countries like America, where recidivism is at its worst and the prison population is at its worst, we can see absolutely that like the focus here is on profit, The focus here is on punishing the prisoners. And I think that's a problem that exists outside of the dichotomy of should we or should we not imprison nonviolent offenders.
Well, I mean, I don't know that much about Norway, but I mean, perhaps you're right. Perhaps if we could fix the prison system, then it would, then people wouldn't be so traumatized by going to prison. But like as of right now in the United States, with the way that it is, with the massive amounts of incarceration that we have, the amount of people that are suffering because of nonviolent offenses and the kind of damage that it does to their life, I would say that like that is you know, and I think I'm going to stand by this principle that I set forth from the beginning, that I don't think there's any need to imprison somebody who is nonviolent. Now, you bring up Al Capone, but I would not consider Al Capone to be nonviolent. In fact, I think the implication was that it was because of the fact that we are pretty sure that he was a violent person, and who caused a lot of terrible, violent crime to happen, is the reason that we should be able to use laws that are for nonviolent offenses in order to imprison him. So I don't like, but that only seems to be because we know that he is a violent offender, and we just had to rely on something else because there was a lack of evidence. See, I just don't think that's a powerful enough reason. I'm still pretty unpersuaded.
Well, I'm curious how you can hold that position and also believe that we should treat a person as innocent until proven guilty. It sounds like you're essentially saying that we should selectively choose who we give the right to be treated as innocent until guilty. Like if we feel that a person is sufficiently connected to a criminal organization, we should revoke some of their rights that we afford to all humans.
I'm kind of actually more saying that if we cannot prove that Al Capone is a violent offender, which seems like pretty ridiculous. It seems like they should probably be able to prove that.
Well, no, like literally we couldn't at the time.
But
like,
if we can't,
there's a score.
Okay, well then if we can't prove that, then I think it's just better that he does not go to prison, because it's not worth imprisoning all of the other nonviolent offenders who will go to prison because of that law.
Okay, like I 100% completely disagree that we should allow like extremely dangerous individuals to roam free simply because there is the possibility that we may incarcerate some other people as nonviolent.
Why is he dangerous?
Because he's orchestrating violent crimes. He's orchestrating non-violent crimes.
Wait, but you said you believe that somebody's innocent until proven guilty, and they didn't prove him guilty. So how do you know that?
Because they proved him guilty of other crimes. Whether or not we can prove him guilty of his violent crimes doesn't change the fact that we have reliable intelligence that he is a dangerous individual. I don't have to know that like a person who's shot at me has a gun if I've heard the shot and seen the shot. But if I was going to kill that same person, I would need evidence that they were the person who pulled the trigger. There's a difference between knowing that a person is capable and involved in a crime, and then they're suspending their human rights simply because they're associated with that crime.
But if we can't prove it in the court of law, then obviously there's not sufficient enough intelligence to make that determination. I mean, I kind of agree with you that I feel pretty confident that Al Capone was a violent criminal and caused a lot of damage, which is why I was initially pretty persuaded by your example and caught off guard. But, you know, just thinking more on it, and if I do truly hold that somebody is innocent until proven guilty, even though I feel pretty sure he's a violent criminal, like why would I be so confident to think that I'm right, and without the intelligence community, why would I put so much confidence in them that they're right without them being able to prove it in court?
And like the thing is, like I completely, totally agree that like we shouldn't just presume that people are violent individuals, but that doesn't change the fact that an individual who is or isn't violent is essential to like a criminal network. Like and like whether or not that person is essential to a criminal network doesn't change the fact that they're guilty of certain crimes. Al Capone was absolutely guilty of tax evasion, and that's why we incarcerated him. And that incarceration was essential because it helps deconstruct the organized crime of that era. And throughout the eras, it has continued to be essential in deconstructing organized crime. And whether or not a person is guilty of violent crimes doesn't change the fact that those people are highly involved in the organization and orchestration of crime.
Well, when you say those people, you just like happen to conveniently be disincluding a large swath of actual nonviolent tax evaders. And I don't think that it does anybody any good that they're behind bars. I mean, what are you protecting anybody from? In fact, you're making a potential violent criminal out of one that's not one.
Well, like these people, like if you have committed a violent crime to the point that you're getting incarcerated for like 6 or 7 years, then it's likely you're probably already involved in some way in crime. And like when we incarcerate these people who are involved in nonviolent crimes, like we're controlling a massive amount of their communication, which is how they commit said nonviolent crimes, which is how they contribute to said criminal networks.
Yeah, but
like,
you keep
and again, I'm talking exclusively in the case of like organized crime and individuals who we may or may not be able to prove that they are violent criminals, but we can certainly show that they're organized and instrumental in the orchestration of organized crime.
Yeah, but you keep bringing up a case of which I'd like to see some numbers on it, but I'm assuming that it's a relatively small case. Like there's probably just a lot more tax evaders. I know that my dad personally was guilty of tax evasion, but there's probably a shitload of tax evaders in the United States that should not go to prison because they're not violent offenders. And that's what I'm saying is like there's no good from imprisoning those people just because we want to take down crime rings.
But like why is really it dangerous? Why is it an either or? Like why does it have to be so binary? Like why can't we at the very least on this point agree that we should incarcerate these nonviolent offenders and then perhaps not incarcerate other nonviolent offenders who aren't like connected to massive organized crime?
Right.
It seems insane that we should throw out an entire part of our criminal investigations simply because another separate part of our criminal investigations is slightly better or worse. Like why are these two things
I'm saying
connected?
that I'm actually the one that believes that somebody is innocent until proven guilty, because unless the FBI or CIA or whoever's investigating this crime ring can prove in the court of law that the person that they're trying is a violent criminal, then
well, in this case, they literally did.
Cannot be proven
they prove them to be a non-violent criminal. Like here, you're drawing a distinction between violent and non-violent. Where I'm saying that, like in this instance, these two things are inherently connected. With people like Al Capone and like people in organized crime, like whether or not they commit organized crime, the two are integral to each other. The money that a person funnels or hides or cleans is connected to the empowering of other individuals to commit organized crime.
Right, I understand that, but I understand that, and I do think that's a problem that will be solved better by technology. I think as time goes on, it'll be a lot easier to catch criminals like that.
But like,
I mean, it's a problem to catch. It's a problem to indict massive crime rings to start with, but I don't think that the answer is bringing them up on other charges that can be brought against normal nonviolent people. You know, like a lot of them, like I said, 50% of the United States prison population is nonviolent, and I have a chart for that.
But like, why is this problem of recidivism inherently connected to the indictment of nonviolent criminals when we can definitively prove that there are nonviolent criminals in the case of mafioso members and organized crime members who cause considerable harms? Why is the concept of recidivism inherently tied? Well, no, I can, because I can prove that they're nonviolent criminals involved in organized crime. But I can't prove that they've committed violent crime, though the distinction between the two is almost meaningless. Like, why is the problem of recidivism tied to the indictment of non-violent criminals when we can look at other countries that also indict non-violent criminals but have vastly superior recidivism rates?
Okay, I'd like to see the numbers for Norway, but I mean,
Norway
still
is at 20% recidivism. I'll find it for you now.
Okay. I mean, regardless of what Norway's system is, because Norway has kind of got a very different demographic and population size that they're dealing with. So I don't think we can make a direct comparison. And also, the United States, like you pointed out, is incredible. Like their prison system is just very different. But I don't just on the basis that it's what you seem to be implying is that because these people are incredibly dangerous because of their violence, it's good and preferable to be able to bring them in on charges of nonviolence. But you're also saying at the same time that you think it's important that somebody is innocent until proven guilty. Now you're saying these things are tied together, and that's true, but that doesn't mean that you're proving that they're guilty of violent crime by proving that they're guilty of the nonviolent crime.
But like the problem here isn't that I'm proving whether or not they're guilty of violent crime. The problem here is that I'm saying that like I don't draw a distinction. That's your problem, and you have yet to show me why that distinction of violent crime is so tied to recidivism, which is the basis for why you're telling me that we shouldn't do this. When I can show you other countries that have vastly lower recidivism, but also employ the same techniques that I'm saying are massively beneficial.
Well, I just think it's wrong to put somebody behind bars, for one thing, when they're not a physical danger to anybody. Why restrain somebody when they're not a physical danger to anybody else? That just doesn't make any sense to me.
Because their communications and their involvement with other people, if unmonitored, can cause massive damage, not only to the individual, but to a person's property.
Wait.
Like in the case of in the case of organized crime, a person's communications, a person's meetings with other people, like keeping them contained and having a reason to be able to monitor them is of massive benefit to like our society in stopping violent crimes, even if we can't prove that they themselves have committed said violent crimes.
I am curious to know, like, what percentage of people in prison are organized criminals, like actually participate in organized crime? Because you keep bringing up this example, but I don't think this is going to be I think it's kind of a fringe case. I don't think that most of the criminals in prison are in an organized crime syndicate.
I would actually agree with that. Like, not most of the people in prison are in organized crime, but we're talking about the totality of incarcerating non-violent criminals. And it seems like this is an extremely important point on why we would do such a thing. And earlier, I even agreed that there's an absolutely big problem with incarcerating non-violent crimes. But like the problem here is that while there is a problem with incarcerating certain people for crimes like owning marijuana or selling marijuana, or even some larger things like minor amounts of like tax evasion, while there is like a big problem with incarcerating those people and turning them into actual criminals, there is massive utility and importance placed in incarcerating people for nonviolent crimes. As I've shown you. And as I've also shown you, that recidivism, that problem with our prison system isn't tied to the incarceration of nonviolent prisoners. It's tied to other systemic problems that if we look to societies without said systemic problems, they are massively more competent in these areas.
Yeah, I think that there are ways to deal with things like tax evasion, mail fraud, and price gouging, and that would not require that we put anybody behind bars, and that would basically protect the rest of society from that person's criminal actions. Like, for example, we could make it so that that they're just not allowed to practice business in either the state could prosecute them and say that they're not allowed to practice business, or perhaps the federal government could prosecute them and say that they're not allowed to incorporate so that they could no longer do those criminal activities, or they could have they could be on some kind of probation where they have like an ankle monitor and they're in their home. I mean, there's many ways we could do this without putting them in a crowded, violent place with a bunch of other criminals where they're going to be locked away from their friends and family, potentially isolated, and then when they get out later, have a hard time getting a normal job because they have a record.
And I can absolutely sympathize with that problem. But that doesn't really change the fact that, like, whilst there are problems with it, those problems aren't tied to the incarceration of nonviolent prisoners.
Yeah.
Like, I'm more than happy to move on to prisoners who aren't tied to organized crime. But, like, before doing so, I would have to ask that, like, would you concede the point that, like, incarcerating nonviolent prisoners who are tied with organized crime, you would agree with me that it's important to pursue those avenues of our legal code and our criminal system to allow us to effectively combat these problems?
No, I wouldn't, because like I said, I think that that's setting a really dangerous precedent for actual
Despite the fact
nonviolent
that we can
criminals.
prove
Like
that
that's
these people
going to
have committed.
outnumber them. Well,
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I think that's going to be a problem that will have better solutions than the one you're talking about. I mean, you are using a case from like the 1930s.
Well, I also
and
gave
I
you an
think we can
evidence
have
of
we
the
have
fact that it
more.
exists in the modern day. I gave you our most obvious example of Al Capone, but like another source showed you that like the modern FBI absolutely recognizes the. No, that's fine. I posted both links.
I've been arguing with you, so I haven't been able to click on all the links, but I'm looking at the one right now on recidivism.
Yeah, that's okay. It can be easy to get gish galloped in like a deluge of. But yeah, sure. I think we're just going to have to agree to disagree. I think the fact that it's essential to incarcerate non-violent criminals who are tied with organized crime is an excellent reason why we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater when we're talking about incarcerating non-violent criminals. And while there certainly is a problem, like you haven't proved to me that problem is tied with the incarceration of non-violent prisoners when this doesn't happen in other areas like Norway. The recidivism problem you're specifically talking about.
Sure, I can get that. Can you give me just a minute to read this source and kind of pull myself together? Okay.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Do you want the page where it says that Norway, which is at 20? Because it's a pretty big source. 121, bottom paragraph.
Wait, okay.
Just tell me when you're good and if you want to make a point. But I'm more than happy to move on to non-gang related or non-organized related non-violent.
Okay, so this paragraph says Norway, which at 20% has one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world. Here too, the focus is far more on rehabilitation and less on punishment. The thinking is that justice for society is best served by releasing prisoners who are less likely to reoffend. The Norwegian penal philosophy is that traditional repressive prisons do not work and that treating prisoners humanely provides their chances of reintegrating in society. This is achieved by a guiding principle of normality, meaning that with the exception of freedom of movement, prisoners retain all of their rights, and life in the prison should resemble life on the outside to the greatest extent possible. Well, yeah, I agree. I think that's great. And I think that I want to see the United States move toward that. But I mean, that doesn't necessarily address, like, we don't know from that paragraph if people do not get any kind of PTSD or come out with like higher rates of alcoholism and drug use. And being that there is still a pretty high recidivism rate of 20%, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to see more information on that.
Well, there is like a study, to be fair. But like, I wouldn't expect you to read through the entirety of a study.
Right.
But the problem here is that like, there's a 20% recidivism rate because some of those non-violent criminals may be criminals who absolutely had every intention to reoffend. Like the fact that there is a non-zero recidivism rate is a problem.
No, it's not the fact that there's non-zero, but I would love to see 20% in the United States, but I still like my contention is that I don't think we should be imprisoning anybody who's not a physical danger to anybody else because of the fact that it just does have bad effects on them. And like you saying that the recidivism rate is lower in Norway does not necessarily make that false.
But like, if I was to point towards like the pain suffered by, say, rapists in prison, you would say that like in some ways that pain is justified, yeah? Where it's not justified in non-violent offenders.
Wait, could you restate that, please?
So if we look at like some of the suffering caused by violent offenders who've committed things like, say, rape, you would say that like some of that suffering is somewhat essential to stop them from committing said crimes again, whereas this is not true for non-violent.
I don't know anything about that. Like, I don't think that I want them in prison because I think that they're going to learn anything valuable from it. I want them in prison so that they're unable to continue harming people.
Oh, okay.
Until they can hopefully be rehabilitated or like have shown that they definitely have remorse and have spent enough time away that they've had the chance to actually be rehabilitated.
Okay, so you would say that like if a rapist went into prison for rape and then he suffered some pain, he had to experience some PTSD, but whilst in prison, he was successfully rehabilitated. You would say that like that pain from that PTSD whilst he was rehabilitated would be like somewhat, yes?
Yeah, it would be worthwhile because you're keeping other people safe from that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I would agree with that. But my contention is that there are some people who commit non-violent crimes where the extent of the damage caused by said non-violent crimes is just as great as the violent criminals. If we look at a person, every time I open my notepad, like a giant string of 4s show up. So if we look at someone like Alan Stanford, who operated a Ponzi scheme that defrauded people out of retirees, out of their life savings, pushed their homes into bankruptcy. Like a violent crime is something like arson. A violent crime is something like burglary. If we would incarcerate people for the theft of things and for burning down homes, why would we not incarcerate people like Alan Stanford for pushing people out onto the street and stealing their life savings?
What you're talking about with Alan Stanford is completely different because we can keep people safe from Alan Stanford by not letting that person ever run a business or try to do any kind of investments ever again. And by penalizing him if he does. Like I said, there's also forms of imprisonment where somebody has an ankle monitor and is in their own home. And I know that that's happened to a lot of very rich white-collar criminals. I'm not sure why it can't happen for poorer
so you would control criminals. This person's exchanges with outside individuals?
Well, I mean,
if you're banning him from trading, it doesn't make much sense to allow him to instruct other people to trade on his behalf. Like that's actually a key tactic of most corporate interests.
Maybe they could lose. Maybe they could lose their right to privacy, but there's no use in like locking them up.
But because they're not a
physical danger. Well, you can't, for one thing, you can't prevent communication with the outside from in prison. Plenty of people run gangs from inside prison through communications. Like, for another thing, there are advances in technology where you could more closely monitor somebody. Like, if we set up some kind of measure to monitor somebody's communications to make sure that they weren't doing insider trading or Ponzi schemes through somebody else, while they were on their basically like their home prison period, then that would keep them from harming other people. The only reason to physically lock somebody up is because they're a physical danger to other people.
The problem here is it sounds like you're essentially saying that we should create a secluded prison for this person. You're not telling me that we shouldn't incarcerate these people. You're essentially telling me that we should create a separate prison for them. Like, if we're controlling this person's interactions with outsiders, if we're closely monitoring them, and if we're constructing like a way to keep them confined into their house, then we're not locking that person up. All we're doing is creating a separate private prison for that person. And you know what? I would in some instances agree with it, because absolutely creating an enclosed prison for people who are highly capable of creating criminal conspiracies, it is an extremely expensive, by the sounds of it, option, but it would certainly reduce the amount of crime that person commit. But you're not telling me that this person can't be incarcerated.
Well, I don't accept that by me saying that somebody should be have a lockdown at their home, pretty much, that we're forming another prison, because we're not putting them like in a state penitentiary. We're not locking them up with other criminals. We're not literally like physically limiting them. We are limiting their communications and limiting the places maybe that they can go, right? But I think that they're still allowed to go, even if they have an ankle monitor, they're still allowed to go quite a few places and live a relatively normal life. We're talking about two incredibly different things. So, I mean, while I think it's fair to argue about the definition of the word prison, when we're talking about imprisonment, I don't think that's when I'm talking about imprisoning nonviolent offenders. I personally am meaning in a state or federal penitentiary.
But like the alternative, seems like you're essentially allowing people who've caused amounts of damage, highly equivalent to violent crimes, and in many ways, like Alan Stanford affected like hundreds of people. There's very few murderers or rapists or thieves who've affected that number of people. The idea that like we should, for some reason, go easy on these people simply because they don't constitute a danger to a person's body, when the amount of harm they've caused would be impossible if they intended to do just that. Like why should we take it easier on these people than we should on violent offenders?
Well, perhaps there's a difference there, because perhaps you think that prison is a place to send people to punish them, when I don't really see that. I think I see it as a last resort to send people to keep those who are a violent threat to others locked in a place where they can no longer be a violent threat to others.
Well, no, I'm still absolutely focused on rehabilitation. But I feel like if the consequences of your crime are essentially that like you get sent to like a fairly free range prison at home, as opposed to being deliberately tried to rehabilitate perhaps in like a private domicile, then you're not making a real effort to disincentivize people from committing these kinds of Ponzi schemes and crimes. Like, again, like I'm perfectly fine with perhaps incarcerating people at home, but the problem here is that like you're essentially telling me that like we're going to monitor this person's communication, we're going to restrict their physical movement, but like we're going to allow them to talk to people unmonitored. Like, how much money are you pouring into this one person's private incarceration? Like,
I
why are we
don't.
affording this person so many resources when it would be simpler to perhaps focus our prison system on rehabilitation, and allow those organized centers of rehabilitation?
Well, wait, there was
to
you
work
are gish galloping me right now. Let me respond. There's a lot of information being thrown at me. Like, for one thing, there were many assumptions being made there. For one thing, I don't like when you say disincentivizing, I don't think that there's actually any good evidence that there is a deterrent effects to prison sentences. And I don't think that people having basically having any of their means of communication to trade or do business inside their home wouldn't be any less disincentivizing, supposing there were some kind of disincentivizing effect, which again, I don't think there is. And then also, you're talking about expenses and how expensive it is to incarcerate somebody at home. I'm not really sold on the idea that incarcerating somebody at home would be more expensive, especially if we didn't um, expect that they still maintain their bills and expenses, and let them have the permission to go to a job, normal job, not any job related to the criminal activity they were doing before, but maybe they could be a manager at a Denny's or something like that. There's no reason that we can't let them work and pay their own bills and buy their own food, and then we spend some money on looking at their communications and what they're doing, and to check in on them and make sure that they're not doing any of the business that they did before where they took advantage of people, and that they're not allowed to incorporate or get any kind of special licensing in order to do that business. So I don't think it's that going to be that expensive. And so I feel like you're kind of making a lot of assumptions there.
First of all, when you say that you don't feel that incarceration is a sufficient incentive not to commit those crimes again, I'm curious if you have any evidence to back up.
Wait, what?
Well, you told me that you didn't think that incarceration or the threat of incarceration was sufficient to disincentivize that person from committing that crime. Do you have any evidence to support?
I could probably find some. That's
So
just
you don't
based
have
on studies that I don't have any on hand, but I've read plenty of studies that that deterrence theory is pretty bunk, and that prison sentencing doesn't actually disincentivize anybody
despite
from doing anything.
Evidence of a prison system that, due to its recidivism, can fairly easily be proven to show that it does in fact disincentivize people from committing said crimes because of its extraordinarily low recidivism.
Wait, are you bringing up Norway again?
Yeah, absolutely. Norway's prison system has an extremely low recidivism rate. People who go in tend not to come out at about 20%. That seems like it's a fairly good justification for saying that.
You're attributing that to deterrence when earlier you attributed that to rehabilitation. These are two extremely different things.
No, I'm saying that threatening a person with incarceration is a good reason. And when they do get that threat, the threat works. They go into prison, we rehabilitate that person, and then they leave.
Do you have evidence for that? Because I don't think that's true. And I'm trying to find something right now. I'm trying to find information on that right now. But
sure,
it's kind of hard on him.
It seems like if you
in the meantime, I'm just kind of letting you make all these assertions.
Well, no, it seems like if you threaten a person with incarceration and then that person is incarcerated and then they don't go back into prison, that seems like a pretty good incentive not to commit that crime in the future. But to move on, you're telling me that I'm can just as easily monitor a person's communications in their home as we can at prison. I'm also interested in seeing evidence for that. Part of the part of the utility of a prison. Part of the utility of a prison is the organization of resources dedicated towards the prisoners. And part of that dedication of resources is making it difficult for those prisoners to communicate. When we take prisoners out of a system with dedicated systems, it seems like it would be a lot harder to monitor their communications and stopping them from committing trades through other individuals, such as like Alan Stanford's Ponzi scheme.
I don't think that there's any more evidence for that than there is for the idea that putting criminals together in a prison actually gives them more opportunities to do more crimes. I mean, like, unless we can pull out a study and maybe we could both take a couple minutes to research this project, because I believe I've offered you evidence that deterrence is not effective. But like, I don't think that
statements like the
what?
NIJ, like what you've written down here is just a summarizes a set of research. Or it's not. I think they are referencing some research.
Are you saying the National Institute of Justice is not a good source?
No, I'm saying that like the source itself is simply making statements as opposed to like supporting them, but they are linking other sources. And it's not addressing the potential utility of threatening a person with incarceration. All it's doing is referencing elements around it. But again, like when we take, whilst yes, criminals can coordinate in prisons, their communication outside of the prison is extremely limited. And that's what I'm talking about. When you take that prisoner and you take him out of the prison, the systems dedicated towards controlling and monitoring their outside communications don't exist. And thus, like, and especially in cases of non-violent crimes where these communications are essential, you're threatening.
I think that they absolutely could exist. I mean, if we can take somebody's freedom away of movement and put them into a prison, then why can't we take their freedom away of having private communications and monitor all of their digital?
You're saying this person can work at. You're saying this person can move around, and like, well, if in a perfect world we could say that we knew with certainty a person who has defrauded people out of their life savings and kicked them out into the street would never commit that same crime again, I would say it's awesome that person could go and like instantly pick up and go and move another job. But like, we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world where like we have to be very careful about these people causing massive amounts of harm through their communications, through their choices in committing these Ponzi schemes, these fraud. And it seems that like you're taking this person out of a system specifically dedicated to doing that, and you're putting them in a system that is significantly less suited to fulfilling that same purpose of stopping them from.
You haven't given me any reason to believe that they couldn't do just as much damage from inside a prison as they could from outside a prison with their communications monitored. Like if their phone calls and emails could just be randomly searched while they were on probation, I don't see how that would be any less effective than just being monitored by guards.
Who were like, I've shown you Alan Stanford. Alan Stanford hasn't committed another Ponzi scheme since we arrested him. Al Capone didn't commit any crimes in prison, as far as we're aware.
I could just as easily bring up Tookie Williams, who actually did like run a gang from inside prison.
Okay, so a violent criminal. So what non-violent crimes was he accused?
A violent criminal's ability to like run a gang inside prison isn't any different than a non-violent criminal's ability to run a Ponzi scheme from inside prison. They both require communication, which you can do. You can make phone calls. You can send letters. I believe some people have access to electronic forms of communications in prison.
So can you prove that this person would be just as effective outside of?
I can't.
Like it seems that you're me with the burden of proof on so many cases, and yet you're not like as comfortable with providing it.
I don't think that that's the case, because I think you also have a burden of proof here, and that you're not fulfilling, because like there's plenty of stories of people running crime syndicates and schemes and businesses from inside prison.
And you think those people would be just as capable of running those crime schemes and systems outside of? You don't think that like the having to carefully code and monitor your communication outside of prison
I think when it comes when it comes to like electronic communication, it's a lot easier to monitor what somebody is doing and saying by just taking away their right to privacy and like looking at their emails and their phone communications. Rather than, I mean, because you can't have a guard follow them all around the prison, and you know they're not going to monitor their communications from inside the prison, because then they would have to do that like for everybody.
Devices inside their prison cell, and their access to electronic devices is fairly heavily gated. Whereas if we just let up the house, would we just have to have a person standing by watching the thing all the time? Like it seems like you're telling me that like just because a person can do bad things in a prison means that we should stop putting we should stop putting them in prison, when there's like dedicated systems that work directly to counteract their actions within prison. And like not only that, like you're telling me that like we shouldn't incarcerate non-violent offenders like gang bosses and mafia members who their incarceration for non-violent crimes is essential to deconstructing the mechanisms of organized crime, simply because there are other people who are incarcerated for systemic reasons outside of the dichotomy of non-violent or violent crimes. And now you're telling me that simply because a person can orchestrate or commit or organize a crime inside a prison, that we should also throw out that system of organization.
Yeah, no, because that is actually a good reason, because they can do communications inside of prison. They do communications inside of prison. It actually is a good reason. And you just incredulously posturing at the statement just because like you think that I somehow have more burden of proof than you, even though we're in a time limited debate. We only have a couple of minutes left and neither of us have proof for this claim. And we're both just kind of speculating is it's just an empty gesture.
I can point to the utility of doing these things. Well, I can show you societies where they do incarcerate people, where they do incarcerate just as many non-violent offenders, and they have a low recidivism. I can point towards like people that we've arrested who haven't committed further crimes. I can point to the utility of these systems.
These things don't point
to the utility of the absence of those systems because they don't exist.
These things don't mean the things that you're saying they do, though. Like you're saying that they mean certain things. And I think that I demonstrated and told you about how the recidivism rate in Norway does not explain away or excuse the kind of psychological damage that prison causes and the kind of stereotype that's associated with being a felon and the kind of like lifelong issues somebody might have once they get out of prison, and including their friends and family maybe not trusting them as much. And all of these consequences are not necessarily shown to be false by a lower recidivism rate, even though I'm really glad for Norway. And I think that would be preferable for the United States.
And I agree with a lot of what you said. But the problem is you can't be sure of anything you've said. Whereas I can prove that like some of the things that I have said have given us absolutely useful utility. And I would love a world where we could point towards our prisons that are perfectly effective, or even a world where there are no prisons. That would be amazing. But at the current moment in time,
I've given a pretty good argument for why on the basis of being innocent until proven guilty, it's not good to set a precedence where people who are nonviolent go to prison just to catch some violent criminals on a technicality.
Who committed nonviolent crimes are just as guilty. It's not that they're not guilty; they have absolutely committed crimes.
Just as
and
guilty
we are trying to monitor and maintain. They are just as guilty as the violent criminals, and they are just as much of a danger to the people in the outside world. Just because a rapist has affected 2 or 3 people with rape doesn't mean that the person who's defrauded dozens of people, hundreds of people out of their life savings, like Alan Stanford, and pushed these people into like bankruptcy so they're fucking homeless. Doesn't mean
people
that
like Alan Stanford are not just as dangerous as violent criminals. The reason we put violent criminals behind bars is to keep them from literally physically attacking people. There are other alternative ways to keep people from committing crimes that are nonviolent when they're outside of prison, especially with today's technology.
But you're putting people at risk by making these assumptions. And while it would be lovely if they were true, you're taking risks with members of our society.
Right, and
by
you're
taking away
ensuring you're ensuring that people that don't deserve to be locked away in prison, getting all of the deleterious effects, mental effects from it, are going to go.
show you that like a lot of those deleterious effects are due to other systemic problems. Because in Norway, we can see that like the recidivism is much lower. We can see that,
but
like,
that doesn't say anything about the mental health of the people that leave just because they don't go back.
So, yeah, sure. Do you want to go first, Eddie, or would you like me to go first?
You can go ahead and go first.
I think there is a huge amount of utility from being able to pursue people who've committed non-violent crimes and then incarcerating them in a set of systems we know to control their output. And while there are definitely negative effects of incarcerating non-violent prisoners, we can see that like a lot of those negative effects are very heavily tied to what society it's taking in. And I think that like incarcerating non-violent prisoners, as it stands in our current society, again, offers massive utility and is an essential part of our legal system, and that making changes with that, whilst possibly good, put people at risk. And so as it currently stands, there is absolutely every reason to incarcerate non-violent prisoners. All right, you're good. Oh, I'm done.
Yeah, just 1 second. Sorry.
Oh, it's all G.
All right. I've contended and maintained this entire time that the only reason to incarcerate and physically imprison a person is if they pose a physical threat to other people. And this is because, one, on the principle that there's no physical threat to other people, so that there's no reason to physically limit the person. There's no way to prove that physically imprisoning somebody is going to reduce their rate or is going to prevent them from doing nonviolent criminal activity. And furthermore, that imprisoning somebody causes psychiatric damage, and in the case of the United States, higher recidivism, and more like the increased likelihood to come back to prison. It also causes damage to familial relationships and ties, and ultimately makes the person more likely to lack a safety net and the ability to get a job once they get out. It's very serious business to put a person in a state penitentiary with violent offenders and other criminals, where oftentimes they will be encouraged and more likely to need to do crimes because they will be threatened and put in situations where they'll be dealing with violent prison gangs. And it does not make sense to put them there when they pose no physical threat. My interlocutor, even though he's very intelligent and has made a very good argument, has not demonstrated that it is worth doing so just because some violent mafia criminals are caught on technicalities, as I don't think it's been established that they are any kind of substantial portion of the prison population. And the example of Norway doesn't really show that there's no damage to prisoners just because they happen to return to prison less. Also, I do not believe that he was able to show that deterrence is something that works, where I provided a counterexample with studies. And that's all I have for my closing statements. Thank you.
Cool. It's a wrap. Thank you guys. Appreciate it. For everyone listening, I just posted a voting poll in the debate chat text channel. Again, real quick, please base your vote on who you think performed better in the debate, had the better argumentation, and opposed the opposition better, of course. And thank you both for debating. Appreciate it, of course, and thank you all listening for tuning in. It was a really, really fun tournament. I thought it was very productive, really creative, and I think we all had a lot of fun.
Oh, that was a good one.